Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question related to the process or workflow, and then I want to jump over to some of the business and technology kind of questions. So we've gone the forward translations. We've decided that MT is a no-no. We want to have that the readability by the target audience. We get to consolidation, and we have to pick the best ones, put it together in a document. Now we've got to do something called a back translation. Kristin, can you tell us what's a back translation and what's the best practices for doing a back translation?
So a back translation is what it sounds like. It's putting the forward translation back into the source language of the original text. In this process, these instruments are generally prepared in English, so it goes into a foreign language, a back translator then back translates it back. And the purpose of a back translation is to identify potential errors. It is a tool. It is not meant to be used as a final product. A lot of times you'll hear that back translations don't need to be particularly polished. I agree and don't agree with that, because if you don't produce a good translation, are you indicating that there's something wrong with the forward translation? We get a lot of instructions as back translators to translate literally. And as we discussed, Mark, I think some back translators take that instruction too literally. If you back translate overly literally, to the point that you create this really stilted, awkward English text, then the user of that back translation might assume that there's something wrong with the forward translation. You should accurately reflect errors if there are actual errors in the forward harmonized translation. I once did something where somehow along the way, liver got translated as kidney. Like that's a big one, right? So in the back translation, I need to reflect that. And then that's such a big deal that I also like very much flag that with a comment and in an email and all sorts of things, because those are not the same organs. But it's a tool, and the tool is supposed to identify issues that need to be corrected in the process. So back to my example of raining cats and dogs, if the appropriate, culturally appropriate, linguistically appropriate expression is used in the forward translation, I would argue that a literal translation of that back into English is not helpful, because to literally translate that back into English, for example, from French, you're going to get an expression about a cow, and they'll think that the forward translators had no, if the user of the translation does not know the source language, they're going to think that there's an error in the forward. So I would argue that something like that, when it's an idiomatic expression that is correctly used in forward translation, should be back translated with the appropriate idiomatic expression. But yes, it's a tool. It's not going to be a published text. It raises or does not raise questions. And the instruction to translate literally needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Okay, so going forward, you're concerned about your target audience translating back, more or less a literal translation so they can get an understanding of what it was, but not too literal. Any other comments from our panelists? Anna Sofia.
Yeah, but just to reinforce what Kristin said about the back translation being a tool, and it's not, its purpose is not to be a translation, and we mentioned one of the quality assessment tools. So the back translation needs to be, like Kristin said, correct, idiomatically correct, convey the same meaning, but above all, flag errors in the forward translation, because we what I often see is that the back translation does not reflect errors. The back translation does not flag, for example, if there's a typo in the forward translation, the back translator needs to flag that. It can, even if it's a typo that allows to fully understand the meaning, okay, it's a typo, it's just a missing letter. Okay, you can back translate it correctly. You don't have to delete words from the English word, but you have to leave a comment. You have to flag it that there's a typo in it, because that's part of the quality assurance process. So it's, and again, I think that goes back to the lack of training issue that we see in the forward translation. There is also a lack of training and clear debriefing about the purpose of the back translation. So it's not just to translate, because it's not going to be published, like Kristin said, is to make sure that everything, that the concepts are there, that it's idiomatic, that it is free of typos and free of errors. And for that, it's not just to, okay, so I have this text written in Portuguese, I have to back translate it literally, more or less literally into English. No, you have to replicate errors, flag errors. That's the fundamental aspect of the back translation, in my perspective.
Excellent, thank you, Rafa.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I completely agree with the comment that at the end of the day, the back translation is a tool to detect not only terminology errors, as Kristin was mentioning, of translating lung versus kidney, or I don't remember the organs, but yeah, different organs. But I think like also, especially taking into account like what the end goal of linguistic validation project is also trying to understand the nuances of the front translation. Are they being, or is the front translation being understood by the target audience the same way that the original text was? So in that case, it's like, is there, or are there any other changes that need to be made that not necessarily are wrong linguistically, but there are certain connotations, certain elements that might not be accurately the same, or at least not perceived the same way. And we also need to get that from the back translation when you are doing that review.
Thank you. Last one on this one, Eva.
Thanks, Mark. So I just want to clarify for those who may not be that experienced with this type of work, that generally the back translation does serve that purpose, and it's a really important step. But also the back translation can only do a certain amount in identifying things like typos and grammatical errors. There's generally, it serves, in my experience at any rate, for a monolingual reviewer to go in, an expert to go in and say, oh, here's something we may see as an issue, here's something we may see as an issue. And then this is my part of the equation. I go in and I look at those comments, I address the comments, look to see where any errors may be, whether it's the back translation, and back translations are usually quite good. But there's maybe some misperception, or maybe it's the forward translation that's wrong. And then I also go in and at that stage, check the final reconciled forward translation with the inclusion of the changes made based on the back translation and the comments for additional errors or typos. So there are additional steps beyond the back translation. So this is really an iterative process made up of, I don't know, 10-ish steps that I think people who may not be as familiar with it really need to understand, that this is a long process with a lot of people involved, a lot of variables, and we all have our little expert parts in that. A back translation can do a lot to clarify that.
Excellent. Well, I said thank you for that, and I said this was the last one, but Kristin, you know this is your area of specialties, and you got your hand up, so this is the last one. Go ahead. You're on mute.
I would just say that there are times when you're back translating, depending on the structure of the language or whatever, where your back translation actually cannot reflect the error. There's just like the verb is conjugated wrong or whatever it is, and your back translation, there's not really any way for you to reflect it without a comment. It's really important to comment, right? Like you don't want to let these things slide in linguistic validation. So comment away, add them in Microsoft Word. Some companies do these things in tables and they have a whole comment column. You do want to point out anything funny, even if you're not actually able to reflect it in the back translation because of the structure of the language.
Excellent. Good feedback, and another awesome use of that audit tool in the memoQ TMS. So, Anna Sofia, I said last one, but this is the last one. Okay, you have one more comment, and then we got to move on.
Yeah, no, just to continue the comment, Eva's comment about this is the process, just to be clear that after the tool is back translated, so the process doesn't end here, like Eva said, it doesn't start here and it doesn't end here. So then the version that has been reconciled based on the forward translation will be corrected and will be updated based on the back translation feedback and results. So that's why it's important to use for the back translator, that the back translator leaves comments and feedbacks, because that will the back translation will be used to correct those issues in the forward translation. So, and then only then the final version is tested with patients or reviewed by the expert clinician. So that's why it's important. And just one more thing, what we are saying here about the back translation is also what justifies why it's also not a practical thing to use machine translations in a back translation, because I don't know if Kristin and Eva have the same experience as me. This same experience is that it's being used as well for the back translation step. Instead of having one back translation performed by a human translator, I've been getting two back translations, and one of them it's clearly a machine translation. So what's the purpose of that machine back translation? It's really useless, because it didn't flag any errors. It translated too literally, like cats and dogs. So also in back translation, using machine translation will ultimately defeat the purpose of back translation as a quality assurance process.
Awesome. I'd like how you brought the big picture instead of just the actual work of the translation, but why are we actually doing this? And that is to make sure that those forward translations are actually, accurate, or where they can be improved. And I mean, we've gone through several steps of the process. There are more steps like the review process and so on. But before we do that, I want to go over to Richard for a second, because Richard did a lot of work with, helping to kind of develop our platform, our TMS, to support some of the workflows and some of the very specific kind of functionalities required for linguistic validation. Richard, maybe could you just take a couple of minutes and talk about how a TMS can support and make some of these processes less manual?
This is my workstation at home. I have two 32-inch CAD/CAM monitors here, so they're big monitors. And this is the process, the entire visio of the process. Everywhere where you see this sort of orangey beigey color is an interaction between the TMS and the memoQ. That is the translation management system that's kind of the puppet master telling memoQ what to do. So as you can see, there's a lot of different processes and items that transpire to make this happen. Specifically, we had a couple of challenges there. One of them was, how do you actually create a back translation project in a TMS? Because essentially what you have to do is take the reconciled forward translation, and what was the target language has to become the source language, and the original source language has to disappear out of the translator's view so that they're not influenced by the original source. So we created a unit that we call the flipper, and that it does exactly what I described. Then also we often have situation with this particular customer where a project may consist of a number of documents, and not every document goes through the same path. Some documents may require dual forward translation and no back translation. Other documents or instruments might require dual forward, dual back. There's all kinds of variations, and it can be within a project. Each individual document could have a different path. The third big one is the bottom one there on my screen, which is how do we create a format for people who are not conversant in translation technology to evaluate the translations. And this particular customer opted to use Word files. So they came up with these kinds of forms where you'd see the source language, target language, then this is the cognitive review form. Then the particular question, if there's one question, or sometimes there can be 2 or 3 questions. Then as you can see, there's a comments field. The one in the top form, the 1, 2, 3, 4th comment field there, it's white. The comment field is beige, and the target language field is where the reviewer actually enters desired changes. And these comments accumulate as the project progresses through the various types of forms. Now, in terms of forms, here are some of them. There's the back translation review form. It might have 1 back translation or 2 back translations to be reconciled. There's the clinician review form. Cognitive debriefing, which has come up in conversation some now. The various proofreading forms and other review forms for the authors and for the customers. And so those are some of the technical challenges we had to deal with.
Excellent. Thank you. So what I'd like to ask now is ask the panelists, and this is open to anybody, is, you know, the processes for linguistic validation are much more complex than typical translation processes. Richard just touched on some of the ways that memoQ has helped to kind of automate or facilitate some of those processes. Maybe I'd like to hear from you how you balance technology with the need for maintaining the integrity of the purpose of each step. So, for example, we talked about machine translation earlier, and that was a unanimous no, right? But what is it, you know, what about when it comes to a translation memory or terminology databases? Is there a role to leverage memory, or if you're leveraging a memory, does that kind of obstruct you from translating to the target audience's requirement? Any thoughts? Richard, a long time no talk.
I wanted to just complete then what I say. In the event you have dual forward translations, for example, those individual translators operate in completely independent environments, so they don't see each other's work.
Thank you.
So that's an important aspect, and the same would be true for back translation. It's only until you get to the reconciliation step, then both translation memories are the reconciliation environment in memoQ shows the hits from both translation memories, and the reconciler can choose which hit to take. So that's how that's dealt with technologically.
Awesome. Thanks.
In our front.
Rafa, you had your hand up, your virtual hand. Yellow high five hand. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna Sofia brought it up earlier, so if you want to go first,
No,
but
Oh, sorry. I'm having trouble keeping up with that. I just saw when I asked for questions, I saw a bunch of hands go up. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
no, I was sorry. Go ahead.
No, I said go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that.
Sorry,
No, I was gonna say I definitely think that while we said no to machine translation and we were very clear on that, I think we were pretty in sync in the matter. I think like in terms of translation memory, glossaries, anything that is reference materials, previous translations, that can be useful as well to actually bring up certain consistency with content that has been previously approved, validated, and that you have certain elements. Because definitely, especially if the source doesn't change, you don't want to change the question into the target language, because then that can bring up a new kind of worms of, okay, if the target language now is different from, but the source hasn't changed, maybe the understanding of the question has changed, and that can bring up a lot of new questions regarding how valid the new data that has been gathered is.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Anna Sofia?
Yeah. Just to pitch in about the use of, for example, translation memories. So I think they may be useful to a certain extent, but they have to be carefully curated and used, because I'm thinking about running a tool through a translation memory, but it really depends. For example, is it a frequency scale? Is it a quality? Is it a difficulty level? Difficulty scale? It will depend on that, because for example, in the response options, that, for example, how difficult it was, and usually the response options go like quite difficult, very difficult, not completely easy, absolutely easy. So it will depend on the what we call STEM question, because of the actually question bit itself, because it has to be adjusted to that particular question, because it will have to be translated differently based on how the question is asked in the questionnaire. And then there's also another issue, for example, with languages that have gender, there are gendered languages, for example. So if we have in our translation memory an approved and locked translation for a specific response item, for example, and it's in the masculine form, but the question requires a response option in the feminine. So we have to be able to change that, and so translation memories have to should be useful, especially for in large questionnaires. I don't see how it is really useful in short questionnaires, but it has to be carefully curated and not taken as, okay, so these segments are pre-translated, are locked, and you shouldn't touch them. So otherwise we'll just create issues, and that will be cumulative issues throughout the process.
Makes a lot of sense. Eva?
Excellent point, Anna Sofia. I also think that it can be useful to have a translation memory or some use of automation when you have an existing tool that you need to insert and that you need to maintain consistency with, but it has to be carefully curated. And I think this is probably a case where you want to have a project-specific translation memory only, and as Richard said, only visible to certain people at certain times. What I would like to ask actually is, I have brought up the issue of actually seeing the tool as it is laid out. So I know that my memoQ doesn't always work with the preview function. So I would like to ask about the preview function and how that would be done, and to what extent that would be visible to people working on different stages of that project.
Perfect. And Richard already had his hand up. So
Yeah.
over to you, Richard.
Okay. The preview functionality is, of course, a factor of whether or not the reviewer is working online. If it's a translator, then the fidelity of the preview depends on the file format. It's better for certain file formats than others. That's current fact of life. We're always striving to find ways to improve that. In the particular case that we've created, the particular solution that we created, we did not make any changes or amend the preview functionality. And as I showed, that particular customer uses the offline review forms. So like the clinician review or the cognitive review do not happen in context. So yeah, I can understand that's a real, it could be in certain circumstances a worthwhile endeavor to improve. I originally raised my hand because we were talking about translation memory, and I believe that a question came into the comments field about what happens when the customer changes the source document when it's mid-process. And that's a question that we dealt with a lot with our customer, trying to find, well, when do we absolutely forbid a document entering an ongoing project? And certainly, for sure, once it's gone into back translation, once the reconciliation has happened, it makes no sense to change. And at that point, the new source document or the changed source document has to become a project in and of itself. And it's incumbent upon the clinical trials company to impress upon their customers that they do not flagrantly change source documents once they're in process. Now, memoQ, in the context of the forward translations, as long as you haven't gotten into the reconciliation step, it's there. memoQ offers some help with either leveraging translation memories or using the X-translate feature. Then you have to be really careful about what you do with the comments, because if there's existing comments, do you keep them? Do you not keep them? Some decisions have to be made about how you deal with that situation. It's an ancient problem in the whole field of localization. Customers love to change source documents. I think we've all dealt with that. So
Definitely.
Did I answer the question? I hope.
Eva?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. And two more hands. Stephane?
Yeah, when you first asked the question, my first reaction was actually to think that each instrument should be treated as a unique piece of content and tool that we translate. And while while that's true, we cannot not leverage from translation memories that exist. But I think what's important when you say curated, Anna and Eva, I think what's important is, and that's what we have developed at Acolad, is to make the translation memories with a lot of metadata, so information about the context, where it comes from, when and where it has been validated, and even make them so hierarchies of memories that have either a study-specific background or even sponsor-specific, so that the risk would be to have a big bucket of content and you just use it randomly without creating context when leveraging what you have in your databases. So what we create is, like I said, study-specific translation memories, because these capture data about the patient, their background, the therapeutic area, and instruments that have been used within that therapeutic area that make relevant whether or not you can reuse content that you have in your database. So that's how I would describe how the creating of the translation memory needs to be done.
Awesome. And just like to point out, I mean, use of translation memory, I think it's obvious, but it's just one part that a TMS or other tools can facilitate the workflow. And so it's, yeah, and it's probably not even the most important, definitely not the most important part. But Anna Sofia.
Yes, thank you. About the use of a CAT tool in the for the linguistic validation. So I have a mandatory list of must-haves and a wish list. So just like taking the opportunity. So I think that to fully use a CAT tool in the linguistic validation. For example, you have to allow to have an interface that allows you to view multiple columns. Mm-hmm. You have to from the point of someone who does the reconciliation, you must have the option of seeing the original for translation number 1, for translation number 2, and the reconciled version. And then when the process goes to back translation, you have to have the option to view the original, the back translation, and your reconciled version to make it to make the changes while without having to alternate windows or check reference documents. So basically, if we are able to do that and in one single window, that would be a technology working with us, right? And on my wish list, for example, in back translation, the possibility of accessing the comments of all of the back translators' comments, whether you use one back translation or 2 back translation, having that possibility would be really useful. And then, and I think that this is the most difficult to implement item on my wish list is, for example, finding a way to incorporate the list of concepts that has been developed as a term base, where we have the original term, alternative terms, because that's something that is included in the linguistic, in the list of concepts, and the definition, and alternative terms in case it is impossible, and some forbidden terms, for example, because there are terms that the author specifically uses not to use because they are not an option. So that's the ideal CAT tool environment for me at the moment.
So let's turn that wish list over to our Santa Claus of linguistic validation, Richard. Richard, what say you?
Yeah, there's an upside and a downside to what you say. The one downside I would say to what you're proposing, Anna Sofia, is that a lot of times the people doing the reviews are not technologically adept. So that's a barrier that would have to be overcome. Not to say that it should not be, but it exists as a barrier.
Technologically adept in terms of familiarity with the CAT tool or a TMS.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, they could even be located in countries where there's poor internet connectivity, for example. If you think of going into long tail languages, for example. So there are some technological barriers there, but again, the concept is great. The other thing I wanted to address or say is that in the particular customer for whom we developed this solution has as a very first step an evaluation of the source content as it comes into the project. And it's really important to have that step so that the source is as clean as possible, translatable as possible. It may come to the technological solution in a format that does not segment cleanly. So the source text might have to be resegmented in a translator-friendly fashion. So the other thing that you alluded to is when you get a project, you might get a project with, again, let's say five instruments and 20 languages, 20 target languages. that project has to be separated out into individual target language projects that then go through the process. And then at the end of the process, those individual target language segments have to be recombined into a multilingual project. So I'm just pointing out that's just an additional complexity that has to be dealt with. Now, our particular customer dealt with the columnar format issue that you'd ideally see online by exporting to docx, which is a big ubiquitous format worldwide, and then re-importing. So what you envisioned happening online does actually happen, but by virtue of export and re-import.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. Eva, you had your hand up?
I did. Thanks for taking that. I've taken a couple of notes here, so very, very untechnological, but still the easiest way to take things down.
I have a pen in my hand too, so it's okay.
I'm a trained conference interpreter, so I always have a pen and the notebook. So there you go. Thanks, Richard. So what I'm hearing here is that basically we're trying to take a project, a process that is very complex and usually has an Excel spreadsheet that's about this big, bigger than my screen. I'm purposely going past my screen, and trying to make that into a more accessible format, but in a way that kind of increases the complexity. So to address that, I think we're going to need more training on behalf of all the people involved in this process in order to make sure that this goes smoothly, because with added technological complexity, we're also going into a realm of people making mistakes, people not understanding how things work. And Richard, you mentioned, I think, that often reviewers are not tech savvy. I've certainly seen that on the side of clinicians who often have trouble properly from a linguist's point of view, editing a Word file because they're just not, they're clinicians. They're not used to, you know, working in front of a computer and working all these tools. So that is going to be an issue, how you're getting all these things in there. And then two things that I just see here just come to my mind as we were talking about it is the view and the visibility. Anna Sofia mentioned wanting to see all of it. And again, you've got the same thing as with the spreadsheets. You want to see it all, but then it gets really big and really complicated. So easy ways to, you know, add things in, take things out. Like when I work with a spreadsheet, I often will hide columns and put them back in, things like that. I don't know how you handle that, but that would be interesting for me to know how you handle that and how we approach that. And what was my other point? Right, I was talking about the different audiences. Like in some of these diagnostic instruments, I will have parts that address the clinician and parts that address the patient. So it'll be, you know, explain to the clinician what they're supposed to do, and then the questions actually addressed to the patient, for instance. Using that as an example for documents with different registers, we're going to have to find a way, if we're using translation memories or even quality assurance checkers, to differentiate that. For instance, in German, you might theoretically have different forms of address, or you might, as Kristin mentioned initially, have different registers in terms of the language level that you use. Specifically, German tends to have 2 words for almost every medical term. One is the more Latin term that clinicians would use, and one is the more common term that patients would understand. So you would have, you know, for high blood pressure, for instance, you know, whether you have hypertension or high blood pressure, that sort of thing. So I don't know how you would integrate that into a TM, but there's a lot of complexity that we're seeing that we're kind of adding into this. And Richard, I mean, if you're developing a solution to this and you can solve these issues, kudos. That's a big task. I'm not a UX designer, but I can see all the many issues that we're trying to solve here. So I just want to kind of bring those up.
Well, Eva, thank you for the job security.
Yeah, Richard, you go ahead and respond, and then we're going to shift off of the TMS topic after this one. Okay.
Yeah. Well, in particular in the cognitive review form, we built in flexibility to add a number of columns, whereby we agreed with our customer that there is a point of diminishing returns after about 3 columns. We could add more, but you'd probably have to use A3 paper in horizontal format when you print it out. And so there's some practical limits, not theoretical limits. and so you have to accept those as given constraints. Certainly having the flexibility of a computer screen where you can scroll back and forth interactively with the document, it would be a solution, assuming everybody has nice wide screens, which of course are becoming more common. But then you have to think about where the target audience is, and will they have that kind of technology available? So, yeah, those are just some of the built-in constraints that one has to optimize moving forward. Certainly, there's as Mark pointed out, there's a great upside in this area of development. So hopefully we'll see memoQ going there. We're making initial steps in the what's called a in-country review interface, which is a kind of a simplified version of the memoQ web interface that's specifically designed for reviewer personas that are less translation technology educated. That'll be releasing this year, quite soon actually.
So, thanks. So I want to ask one more question related to technology, but not related to localization industry technology. So there is an accelerating movement to the adoption of ECOA and ePro systems. And I'm going to direct this one to Rafa and Stephane to start with. What are you seeing in terms of your customers' requirements? Are they saying, hey, we want something that's going to, allow us to just connect directly in, or the output has to be, ECOA friendly? I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'll start, Rafa, if it's okay. Yeah, we're seeing a tremendous push towards decentralized clinical trials. I go into conferences, and there are, I don't know how many providers in ECOA providers and DCT providers, and talking to them, they have very large challenges to release validated instruments in a fast way to meet the sponsors' timelines, to be able to enroll the first patients. And I actually had a conversation yesterday about the challenge of the ethic committees and IRBs sticking to a conventional way of approving the validated content with screenshots of the instruments to validate them, and the ask was clearly, what can we do to eliminate some of these steps that are extremely time consuming, error prone, and what technology can we offer to suggest and show evidence that if we are integrating a system where we can do the translation all the way we described all the steps in a way that we can also validate the on-screen question, and while validating the functionality testing to make sure that the patients will understand what to do when answering these questions on those digital devices. We have to move fast, and we have to come up with a solution to address that. That's a common issue that we're seeing, definitely.
Awesome. Rafa, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I generally agree with everything that Stephane said. I mean, the only thing I would add is that definitely we are seeing more and more technology that is coming out for screenshot review, depending on the client. As part of the screenshot review, we're able to go into their platform to implement changes, leave comments there. Otherwise, it's all like old school screenshots, which is not very efficient, to say the least. I'm very error prone, as Stephane was saying. So I think like that is something that we've noticed for a long time, and we know like certain LSPs are already even creating their own platforms and technology to implement all of that.
Thank you. Eva, you have your hand up, and before you respond, oh, you don't have your hand up. So I actually would like to ask the linguists, because I think by the time it gets to the ECOA platform, your work is pretty much done. But I do think sometimes there's an opportunity to review some of the UI or the user interface there. I mean, have you had any insights or experience related to that? Anna Sofia.
So sorry, I seem to be.
I feel like I'm playing a quiz
hand.
game, and whoever gets their hand up first gets the prize.
So actually, the linguist work is actually not done when we go to the ECOA migration part, because we are the ones who also check the screenshots and make sure that it has been properly transferred. Because sometimes there are items that are incorrectly migrated, or the formatting, what is in bold in the paper version should be bold in the screen. So, and we must have other concerns, for example, with expansion rate between languages. So, and we work with a paper version, with a standard size paper, and then we have to move that into a screen. And with what happens, for example, between English and Portuguese and other languages, I think French and German faces the same issue, is that translated sentences take much more space. So how do we go about it? Do we decrease the font on the screen? But what about the blind people and visually impaired people? Will they be able to read that text? So we have all these concerns that you have to check during the migration. And then there's also the need to adapt some text, because although we cannot change the text that has been already validated, in the paper version, if the question is, please circle your response, we have to adapt that to a screen and change it into select the best response. So there are changes, there are adaptations, but basically the main concern from a linguistic and cultural point of view, I think, with migration is exactly that, to make sure that the layout allows to be readable, is readable when it goes to the screen. And I agree that the current process of checking this is archaic, error prone, because I still do my screenshot check using Microsoft Excel. So with a screenshot on the left, original screenshot on the left, target screenshot on the right, and then I have to add my comments and saying this sentence needs to be adjusted. And the person doing the adjustment doesn't speak Portuguese, so they have to identify my feedback on that sentence, not because they understand, but because they recognize the letters. So there's another error from time point. So it's a lot of risk.
Definitely. Okay, and we're coming up on our the end of our second hour here. So we've got we should have booked more time for this, but Eva and Stephane, and then we're going to wrap things up.
Oh boy, I'll try to keep it really short. So I have a long background in software localization and software testing, and I just wonder why these things are done with screenshots and not having translators and language experts actually doing software testing. We know how to do that. Many of us who have that experience can do that, and it would be much more efficient. That's all I'm going to add at this point. Thanks for the great.
Thank you for being succinct. Excellent. Good point.
Yeah, I
Stephane?
completely agree here with Eva. I think that's something we need to move to. It's nothing more or less than software localization, and LSPs and translators have these capabilities. And I'll end with this note: the fact that we are seeing more and more decentralized clinical trials or hybrid clinical trials is just going to push more the need for assessments and questionnaires to be developed, because patients will be less going to the site, less interacting with the investigators, and yet the sponsors will have to gather some data and informations and assessments on how their patients are doing. So there will be more and more questionnaires developed in the future, in the near future, with more questionnaires to be translated, to be validated. So that's where I think the push is, and our focus needs to be in revamping and moving fast, finding a solution to address that need.
Great observations, and I hope our product team is listening, because I think there's some great potential developments there. I mean, I'm just listening to this, and it's like my excitement about this area of localization has gone up even higher than it was. I mean, I don't care if you're a linguist, a project manager, an LSP, a technology provider. There's so much potential here. It could be a trainer, an educator, one of our localization universities out there. So there's a huge amount of potential here. I want to have just one last question, and then my closing 2 sentences. And I'm going to direct this one to start to Rafa. Rafa, you're responsible for in part for recruiting. And there's a lot of people out there probably listening, and they can be potential linguists or project managers, or they could be working for LSPs and getting ideas about how to recruit. What's your advice? I mean, how do you there's a lack of qualified talent, people who've been properly trained. How do you go about recruiting people who have the potential, and what advice would you give to people who want to get in the door?
I think like that is the $1 million question. But I generally, when I talk to my team about like when we need to get new resources for linguistic validation, is all about, okay, we have a linguist, a translator, a reviewer that is very good at life sciences, medical, informed consent form, and we are not really using them for linguistic validation. So we first do an approach to see, okay, are you interested? Sometimes it's like, have you worked on this in the past? I mean, and that is like for something that we do for linguists that we already have in our database. Now, whenever we get any profiles that are for life sciences, we already approach the question as like, okay, how familiar are you with this? But when the answer is generally no, then we look further into, okay, are you interested? Because as we were saying earlier, there is really a very limited pool of linguists that are fully trained on all the steps of linguistic validation. So while we would love to be able to just like, yeah, let's recruit people that are fully trained and we can get them up and running in a day, that's not really feasible. So as what Kristin was saying earlier, at the end of the day is either you have a position internally that they are going to train you on it, or working with the different LSPs that are going to mentor you for it. Because otherwise, I feel like if you don't have that prior experience, if you go on your own, it might be very discouraging, because there are so many different factors that can be error prone, that they can be a little bit demoralizing, so to say. So I think that is another element that we need to take into consideration. I know like feedback, we don't always take it the right way because it's feedback and we always try our best. But I think as always, there are so many little nuances here that actually getting feedback during your training is something that is encouraged, rather than taking it personally of, I've done this wrong.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing is proactivity on the side of the recruiter and proactivity on the side of the linguist for reaching out and looking for those opportunities to be trained. Everybody, thank you so much for today. There's so much knowledge in this group here. And I wish we had more time to go down more of the rabbit holes of this linguistic validation topic. Thank you. Thank for the people who attended, and my colleagues at memoQ, Ulrich, for helping them out with the questions. Just as a reminder, this video will be posted in the coming days, and we're going to send a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this event with the link to the video. If you have any recommendations for future life science roundtable topics and/or panelists, please let us know. Thank you so much, everybody, and wish you all an amazing remainder of 2023. Cheers.